The frozen wilderness of Alaska has always stirred the imagination. A land of endless forests, glaciers, and icy seas that whisper stories from another time, long before it became America's 49th state. This land was home to a very different flag, the imperial double-headed eagle of Russia. In the 18th century, when empires stretched their hands across oceans, one kingdom far to the east dreamed of power, wealth, and recognition. That kingdom was Russia. But why would Russia, half a world away, claim a frozen land across the Pacific? What drove an empire to conquer the edge of the world? The answer lies in a mix of greed, curiosity, power, and faith. It is the story of explorers chasing the edge of the world, of traders seeking fortunes in fur, and of a nation desperate to prove itself among Europe's empires. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the world was defined by ambition. Spain controlled half the New World. Britain ruled the seas. France built influence across Canada and the Caribbean. The Dutch grew wealthy through global trade. Every European kingdom fought for land, gold, and prestige. Russia, though vast in land, remained isolated from the oceans. Its empire stretched across Eastern Europe and Siberia, but it lacked warm water ports and overseas colonies. Still, it had ambition. Under the rule of Peter the Great, Russia began to transform from a medieval kingdom into a global power. Peter built cities, armies, and navies. He wanted Russia to stand equal to the great empires of Europe. To achieve that, he looked not only west toward Europe, but east toward the Pacific. The Tsar heard tales of lands beyond Siberia, of islands across the icy sea. Perhaps, he thought, there was another continent. Perhaps Russia could reach the New World, not from the west, as Columbus had, but from the east. By the early 1700s, Russian explorers had reached the farthest edges of Asia. Beyond them lay the Pacific Ocean, and beyond that, mystery. Peter the Great ordered an expedition to find out what lay there. In 1725, the Great Northern Expedition began, led by Vitus Bering, a Danish navigator in Russian service. His orders were simple, yet monumental: sail east, explore, and find new lands. The journey was brutal. Bering's men dragged ships across Siberia, built vessels in the wilderness, and sailed through storms and fog. Many died of starvation or disease. But in 1741, after years of suffering, they sighted land, the snow-capped mountains of Alaska. They had found a new world. Though Bering died on the return journey, his expedition brought back reports of an untouched wilderness, rich in resources, especially sea otters. Their pelts were so soft, so luxurious, that one skin could sell for more than gold in the markets of China. Word spread quickly. Traders, adventurers, and hunters followed. They came seeking the soft gold of the Pacific. The fur trade became the lifeblood of Russian expansion. Small settlements appeared on the Aleutian Islands and along the Alaskan coast. Russia's motives for colonizing Alaska were complex. Economic ambition came first. The furs brought immense profit. Strategic interest followed. Controlling Alaska meant securing Russia's eastern frontier against Britain and Spain. Religious purpose was also strong. Missionaries of the Orthodox Church traveled with explorers, building chapels and converting native Alaskans. And finally, there was political pride. Planting the Russian flag in America symbolized that the Tsars had joined the ranks of global empires. By the late 1700s, Russian presence in Alaska had become official. In 1784, a permanent settlement was founded on Kodiak Island. 15 years later, in 1799, Tsar Paul I chartered the Russian-American Company, a powerful trading monopoly that governed Alaska in the name of the Tsar. Under its first governor, Alexander Baronov, the company expanded rapidly. Its capital was established at Sitka, known to the Russians as New Archangel. From there, Russian ships traded furs across the Pacific, with Siberia, China, and even as far south as Spanish California. Life in Russian America was harsh. Winters were long and deadly. Supplies took months to arrive from across the ocean. The settlements were small and isolated, surrounded by forests and icy seas. The colonists numbered only a few hundred, outnumbered by native peoples, Aleuts, Tlingit, and others. Relations with the native Alaskans were mixed. Some tribes traded peacefully, others fought to protect their land. The Russians often forced native hunters to work in the fur trade, causing tension and conflict. Yet, over time, cultures blended. Russian words entered native languages, and Orthodox Christianity took root among the Alaskan people. For a while, Alaska thrived as a remote but profitable frontier. But by the mid-1800s, its glory began to fade. The fur trade, once the empire's golden treasure, collapsed. Sea otter populations had been hunted nearly to extinction. Profits dwindled, and the cost of maintaining the distant colony grew unbearable. Alaska's isolation became its curse. Supplies, soldiers, and settlers had to travel thousands of miles by sea. Communication with St. Petersburg took months. The land was rich in potential, but poor in practicality. At the same time, Russia was struggling at home. The empire had suffered defeat in the Crimean War. Its economy was weakening. Its leaders needed money, modernization, and peace. Alaska, far away and vulnerable to British power in Canada, seemed impossible to defend. By the 1860s, Tsar Alexander II saw Alaska not as an asset, but as a liability. His advisors proposed selling it before Britain or another rival could seize it. Across the Pacific, the United States had just emerged from its civil war and was eager to expand. The timing was perfect. In 1867, Russia's ambassador to Washington, Edward de Stokel, met with U.S. Secretary of State William H. Seward. After months of negotiation, they struck a deal. On March 30, 1867, the two nations signed a treaty transferring Alaska to the United States for $7.2 million, roughly 2 cents per acre. When news broke, Americans mocked the purchase, calling it Seward's folly and Seward's icebox. They saw Alaska as a frozen wasteland of no value. But time would prove them wrong. Years later, Alaska's vast natural wealth was revealed: gold, oil, fish, and forests. The territory became one of America's most valuable regions, while Russia's decision to sell it was remembered as one of the greatest miscalculations in imperial history. Yet, even today, traces of Russia remain. The onion-shaped domes of Orthodox churches still rise over Alaskan villages. Russian words survive in the language, and the memory of those early explorers who crossed the world to find a new frontier still echoes through the northern winds. Russia colonized Alaska for fur, faith, and glory. It was a quest for wealth and a test of endurance. But in the end, it was also a lesson that empires, no matter how vast, cannot hold what distance and nature refuse to yield. The story of Russian Alaska is the story of ambition meeting the limits of geography, of power, faith, and survival on the edge of the world. When the final document was signed in 1867, the ink dried quickly, but the echo of that signature would travel for centuries. The empire that once dreamed of conquering the Pacific had traded away its frontier, not through war, but through weariness. Russia had sold not just land, but a vision. $7 million for a territory larger than France, Spain, Italy, and Germany combined. $7 million for mountains of gold, oceans of oil, and forests untouched by men. $7 million for silence, for peace, for relief, for the comfort of no longer reaching too far. Alaska slipped quietly from Russian hands into American destiny. And yet, behind the official treaties and formal handshakes, there remains something deeper: the human story. The men who came before they had crossed the edge of the earth. Trappers, priests, soldiers, dreamers, men who left everything behind in pursuit of fortune and faith. From the icy shores of Kamchatka, they sailed east through fog and storm, guided only by instinct and hunger. Many never returned. Some froze in their sleep. Others vanished into the sea. But those who survived wrote a strange chapter in the story of empires, a chapter written in frost and faith. In their diaries, they spoke not of conquest, but of endurance. They described the loneliness of endless nights, the beauty of glaciers that shone like glass, and the haunting silence that made them question the purpose of empire itself. They were not villains or heroes. They were witnesses. Witnesses to what happens when ambition collides with nature. The price of distance. Alaska was never meant to be tamed easily. It was too vast, too cold, too distant. The Russian Empire stretched itself across half the world, but its reach could not warm the frozen coastlines of Sitka or Kodiak. Ships from St. Petersburg took months to arrive, sometimes longer. Supplies rotted, messages arrived late, and the colonists learned to live in a rhythm outside of time, trapped between two worlds. In winter, the sky would vanish into darkness. In summer, the sun would burn through endless daylight, refusing to rest. The Russians built churches, forts, and trading posts. But Alaska remained indifferent. Nature did not yield to empire. They called it Russian America, but it was never truly Russian. It was older, wilder, untamed, belonging to the winds, the whales, and the silent mountains. The faith that followed when the explorers came. They brought not only muskets and fur traps, but crosses. The Russian Orthodox Church saw the land as sacred ground to be blessed, not conquered. Priests traveled from Siberia to spread faith among the Aleuts and Tlingit. They learned the local languages, baptized children, and built small wooden churches that still stand to this day. One of them, Saint Innocent of Alaska, once wrote, "To bring light to this cold land is not to claim it, but to share warmth with those who dwell within it." Through faith, the Russians found something that empire alone could not offer: belonging. And when the empire left, the faith remained. Even today, in remote Alaskan villages, the sound of Orthodox bells still rings through the air, echoes of a forgotten dream that somehow never truly died. The silence after the sale of Alaska. Silence fell over the old Russian settlements. The traders packed their ledgers. The soldiers took down their flags, and the priests prayed one final mass before boarding ships home. The Aleuts and Creoles watched the sails disappear into the horizon. For generations, they had lived between two worlds, the empire that came from across the sea, and the land that never changed. Now, they belonged to a new flag, a new nation, a new destiny. But to them, Alaska was never about ownership. It was about survival, about knowing when to stand against the storm, and when to bend with it. And in that wisdom, perhaps they understood something the empires never did. Lessons from the ice empires believe they can own the world. They draw lines on maps and claim mountains with ink. They name rivers and measure coastlines, but nature does not recognize their borders. The same storms that battered Russian ships would later batter American whalers. The same ice that swallowed Bering's fleet would one day swallow gold miners and oil explorers. Alaska belonged to no one. It only allowed visitors. Russia's failure to hold Alaska was not weakness. It was inevitability. Distance, exhaustion, and the relentless cost of expansion broke the empire's will. But in its surrender, there is something profoundly human, the recognition that even the greatest powers must eventually admit, enough. The empire that sold the cold. It is strange to think of Russia selling Alaska not as loss, but as release. The Tsar's advisors believed they were saving the empire from ruin, and perhaps they were right. Yet history has its sense of irony. Within decades, Alaska's gold rush would draw thousands of dreamers. Its oil would power cities. Its beauty would define a frontier spirit that became central to American identity. What Russia saw as a frozen burden became one of America's greatest treasures. Still, the story is not about winners and losers. It is about how far humans will go for a dream, and how often they realize too late what that dream has cost. Echoes of two worlds. In Alaska, time feels layered. Walk through Sitka, and you can still see the past standing quietly between the trees, the wooden crosses, the Orthodox domes, the Russian names carved into stone. The descendants of Russian settlers and native Alaskans still tell stories in both tongues. Russian lullabies mixed with Aleut chants. Cultures collided, blended, and endured. This, perhaps, is the real legacy of colonization. Not the lines drawn on a map, but the shared humanity that remains when empires fade. Every colony is a mirror. In Alaska's frozen reflection, Russia saw its own limits, and humanity saw the truth of ambition, that no empire is eternal, and no land truly belongs to kings. The human cost of glory behind every flag raised on new soil lies 1,000 untold stories of hunger, of loneliness, of awe. For every explorer who claimed discovery, there were families who vanished in the snow. For every church bell that rang, there were voices silenced beneath it. Empires are built not just with gold and gunpowder, but with the lives of ordinary people who believed they were part of something greater. And yet, what they built so often outlasted their names. The Russians came to Alaska seeking wealth, but what they left was memory, the kind that time cannot erase. Reflection. What Alaska taught the world in the end. The story of Russia and Alaska is not about conquest. It is about the meeting point between human ambition and natural law. It reminds us that the world is not conquered through ownership, but understood through humility. Russia reached across the Pacific to claim the unknown, and in doing so, discovered something far more profound, that the earth itself has a soul. And no empire, no matter how vast, can possess it. History often measures success in land, wealth, or power. But Alaska teaches another measure: endurance, faith, and respect for what cannot be tamed. When Russia sold Alaska, it unknowingly handed over not just land, but a legacy of courage, curiosity, and consequence. The empire that sold the cold left behind a truth that still resonates today. Empires end. Humanity continues. Epilogue. The whisper of the North. Stand on the coast of Alaska today, and listen carefully. You may still hear the echoes of the past, the creak of wooden ships, the chant of orthodox hymns, the cry of sea otters on the wind. The empire is gone, but the memory remains, carved into mountains, frozen in rivers, whispered through the pines. History is not made only by those who conquer, but by those who endure. And Alaska endures, vast, silent, eternal. Perhaps that is why Russia came here, not just for riches or glory, but for something deeper, to touch the edge of the earth and, in doing so, to glimpse the edge of itself in the frozen reflection of Alaska. Russia saw both its power and its limits. And in that moment, across the silence of the Pacific, an empire learned to let go.